Hello and welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently turned off our monetization features, leaving us without the budget to keep our operations running. If you find today's story entertaining, please consider supporting us with just $1, so our dedicated staff can cover their daily living expenses and continue creating these adventures for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description and pinned comment below. Thank you for your kindness, and let us dive into the story. The heavy thud of a solid metal cane echoing against the rusted floor grates was a sound the Tartarus mining station had never experienced before. Kael'thas, the towering six-armed overseer, glared down with predatory amusement. He expected the fragile newcomer to cower or to break, but the old, limping creature without a single scale or claw did not look away. He merely stared back, calculating. To live on the Tartarus asteroid mining station was to forget what light truly looked like. The atmosphere was a suffocating soup of vaporized machine oil, metallic dust, and the sour stench of perpetual fear. The air pressure was kept intentionally high, pressing down on the lungs of the enslaved workers like a physical weight. Deep within the maintenance bowels of the station, Vile huddled in the shadows. Vile belonged to the lumen, a diminutive species known for their natural bioluminescence. Under normal conditions, Vile would emit a soft, comforting blue glow. Here in the crushing dark of Tartarus, his light was nothing more than a sickly, flickering pale pulse, drained by endless cycles of forced labor and malnutrition. The station was technically owned by a distant corporate conglomerate, but the actual law of the rusted corridors was dictated by the Kraggoth. They were a nightmare of evolutionary biology. Each Kraggoth stood twice the height of a standard worker, possessing 6 muscular arms and a body encased in thick, impenetrable horned scales. They were brutal, enforcing their dominance through casual violence and psychological terror. They regularly raided the technical sectors, stealing the meager energy rations of the smaller workers just to watch them starve. Kael'thas was the worst of them all. He was a behemoth even among his own kind, a sadistic gang leader who found immense pleasure in breaking the spirits of anyone smaller than him. The miserable routine of the technical deck shifted when the corporate transport dropped off a new batch of replacements. Among the trembling, frail creatures was something Vile had never seen before. The manifest listed him as a human. His name was Duncan Browning. Compared to the hulking Kraggoth, Duncan looked entirely pathetic. He appeared incredibly old, his face covered in rough, graying stubble. He wore a faded, grease-stained jumpsuit and breathed with a heavy, wheezing sound, his chest rising and falling laboriously in the thick atmospheric pressure. Most striking was his movement. Duncan dragged his right leg, relying entirely on a surprisingly thick, heavy metal cane to keep himself upright. Every step he took seemed to require a massive exertion of effort. During the designated feeding cycle, the workers gathered in the cramped, dimly lit mess hall. Vile had just received his daily ration block, a tasteless square of synthetic proteins, and was hurrying to a dark corner to eat in peace. He did not move fast enough. A massive, scaled hand struck him from the side. Vile tumbled across the rusted floor, and his food tray went flying, scattering the precious ration into a puddle of toxic runoff. Kael'thas loomed over the tiny lumen. 3 of his arms crossed over his chest, while the other 3 gestured mockingly toward the entrance. The Kraggoth gang erupted into cruel laughter. Duncan had just entered the hall, his metal cane clanking heavily against the deck. Kael'thas pointed a thick, clawed finger at the human. "Look at this biological scrap," Kael'thas rumbled, his voice shaking the loose panels on the walls. "They are sending us defective garbage now. A hairless, soft-skinned weakling that cannot even walk on 2 legs without a metal stick. You will not last 2 shifts down here. Cripple." The entire mess hall fell dead silent. The other species curled up, trying to make themselves as small as possible, waiting for the human to break down, cry, or beg for mercy. That was the natural order of Tartarus. Duncan did not shrink back. He stopped his slow, agonizing march. He leaned his weight against the heavy metal cane and lifted his head, his eyes, devoid of any fear, locked onto Kael'thas. Duncan did not look at the Kregoth leader as a terrifying predator. Instead, his cold, piercing gaze swept methodically over the giant. He looked at the way Kael'thas shifted his weight, at the exposed gaps between the thick keratin plates, and at the hydraulic-like joints of the alien's 6 knees and elbows. He looked at the warlord the exact same way a master mechanic looks at a poorly assembled, malfunctioning machine. Duncan did not utter a single word in response to the insult. The human simply broke his gaze away from the confused Kregoth, limped slowly over to where Vale was shivering on the floor, and knelt down with a painful grunt. Reaching into his own pocket, Duncan pulled out his untouched ration block, snapped it perfectly in half, and placed one piece gently into Vale's trembling hands. Several shift cycles passed, each dragging on heavier than the last. The air in the lower assembly deck was stifling, thick with the grinding noise of industrial crushers and the ever-present scent of oxidized copper. An elderly lumen, his bioluminescence completely faded to a dull, ashen gray of exhaustion, staggered under the awkward weight of a heavy plasma conduit. His frail, trembling fingers slipped. The massive cylindrical conduit crashed onto the grated deck, shattering its delicate containment housing into dozens of sharp fragments. Instantly, Kael'thas was there. The massive Kregoth did not yell. He did not need to. He simply reached down with 2 of his thick, lower arms, lifting the elderly worker entirely off the ground by his fragile collarbones. The old lumen kicked his legs helplessly in the air, gasping for breath as Kael'thas's massive upper hands clamped around the worker's thin arms. The warlord smiled a jagged, terrifying grin, preparing to snap the old creature's limbs backward as a brutal, visceral lesson to the rest of the terrified crew. A sharp, metallic clack pierced the hum of the background machinery. Clack, clack, clack. Duncan stepped out from the deep shadows of a primary coolant tank. He leaned heavily on his thick metal cane, his breathing steady, his eyes entirely devoid of any panic or submission. He stopped precisely 10 paces away from the towering alien warlord. He tapped the heavy cane once more against the steel grating, drawing the immediate, furious attention of Kael'thas. Duncan raised his chin slightly and spoke in a tone that was terrifyingly polite, completely foreign to the trembling atmosphere native to the mining station. "Put him down," Duncan said calmly. Kael'thas let out a low, vibrating growl, his grip tightening painfully on the old worker. Duncan sighed softly, shifting his posture as if dealing with a stubborn apprentice. "Your outer carapace is impressive," the human continued, his voice steady and analytical. "Your bones are hard, but your hydraulic joints are not." The calculated insult was entirely too much for the dominant warlord to bear. Kael'thas tossed the elderly lumen aside like a discarded rag and roared, a guttural sound that vibrated through the solid metal bulkheads. He launched his massive frame forward, all 6 thick arms pulling back to deliver a crushing barrage of blows that carried the weight of a falling transport shuttle. He expected the frail human to cower in fear, to turn and run, or to simply be crushed into the floorboards. Instead, Duncan did something utterly inexplicable. He opened his hand and let go of his cane. The thick metal rod did not simply fall. It slammed into the floor with a deafening impact that violently buckled the reinforced steel grating beneath it. The sound was a jarring revelation of physics. Duncan was never crippled. The Tartarus station operated on a localized gravity field of only 0.4 times that of Earth. To a human born and biologically forged in a crushing 1G environment, this alien station was a featherweight world. The impossibly dense cane was never meant to support his frail weight. It was a gravitational anchor, a carefully engineered handicap designed to suppress his overwhelming muscular density and prevent him from accidentally ripping the station's delicate interfaces apart with casual, everyday movements. Freed from his heavy anchor, the old man moved. To Kael'thas, the human simply vanished from his forward field of vision. Duncan moved with a terrifying, explosive kinetic efficiency that completely negated the Kragoth's understanding of mass and inertia. He did not employ flashy martial arts or desperate, uncoordinated brawling techniques. He applied pure, ruthless mechanical engineering to biological combat. As the giant's overwhelming momentum carried him forward, Duncan sidestepped with a blur of speed. He targeted the exact structural weaknesses he had analyzed days ago. The human's heavy boot snapped out in a precision strike, hitting the exact fulcrum point of Kael'thas's primary right knee joint. The massive leg buckled instantly against its natural bending angle. As the warlord stumbled heavily, desperately trying to arrest his own forward acceleration, Duncan stepped directly into the giant's crumbling guard. He grabbed the thick, scaled wrist of Kael'thas's descending upper arm, pivoted his own hips to create a perfect structural lever, and twisted the joint at a violent 45-degree angle. Duncan did not need to overpower the massive beast with brute strength. He simply redirected the warlord's massive, moving weight against his own locked skeletal structure. The sickening crack of thick cartilage and dislocating joints echoed sharply through the cavernous assembly room. Kael'thas crashed face first into the steel floor. The sheer, unstoppable force of his own redirected momentum, shattering the deck plates beneath his armored jaw. His primary leg and dominant upper arm hung at grotesque, unnatural angles, fully dislocated in exactly 3 seconds. The invincible warlord lay completely paralyzed, his alien nervous system overwhelmed by the sudden, catastrophic mechanical failure of his own body. Duncan did not even breathe heavily. His heart rate had barely elevated. He walked calmly over to the cratered grating and picked up his incredibly dense anchor. He leaned his weight back onto the metal cane, reached up with his free hand, and casually adjusted the collar of his grease-stained jumpsuit. He looked down at the whimpering giant trembling on the floor. "Next time, learn to calculate the center of gravity," Duncan said. The entire assembly deck remained frozen in absolute, terrified silence. The atmosphere in the lower maintenance bays slowly began to shift. It was not a sudden revolution, but a quiet, desperate migration. In the sleep cycles following the brutal physical deconstruction of the warlord, the smaller, oppressed workers started to linger near the primary ventilation hub. This was the area Duncan had claimed as his own. Vial was the first to drag his sleeping mat across the boundary, curling his small, faintly glowing body behind a stack of rusted ion scrubbers. Soon, dozens of others followed. They were a pathetic, terrified flock, seeking the protection of an apex predator they did not quite understand. Duncan never chased them away. Despite his gruff exterior and rough mannerisms, the old human proved to be an incredibly dedicated guardian. He did not offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he handed Vial a heavy plasma torch and a pile of discarded titanium plating. Under the human's calm, patient instruction, the fragile workers learned how to weld structural reinforcements. Duncan showed them how to wedge thick steel struts at exactly a 45-degree angle against the bulkhead doors to create an unbreakable physical barricade against external force. During a brief rest period, as the hum of the station's life support cycled into a low murmur, Vial could no longer hold back his intense curiosity. The little lumen sat near the human, his blue glow pulsing faintly in the dim light. Vial looked at Duncan's soft, exposed skin and his flat, blunt teeth. "I do not understand," Vial whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "You have no scales to deflect a blade. You have no claws to tear flesh. You do not even have secondary venom glands. How can a species born with zero natural weapons possess such terrifying kinetic power? Duncan paused, wiping a streak of black grease from his forehead with a rag. He looked down at the alien, his eyes reflecting a deep, ancient weariness. "Because of where we come from," Duncan replied softly. "My homeworld is called Earth. To your people, it would be classified as a Class 9 death world." Vile gasped. A Class 9 designation meant the planet was fundamentally hostile to biological life. "Our baseline gravity is 2.5 times heavier than what you experience on this station," Duncan explained, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a dark storyteller. "Our atmosphere is thick and volatile, subjected to violent weather patterns that can freeze water solid or boil it away within a single planetary rotation. The dirt beneath our feet is entirely saturated with millions of aggressive, microscopic bacteria that constantly attempt to consume our flesh while we are still breathing." The small alien shuddered, his bioluminescence dimming in pure horror. "How did you survive the great predators of such a nightmare world?" A cold, chilling smile touched the corners of Duncan's weathered mouth. "We did not fight the great predators with claws. We fought them with sweat and endurance. You see, Vile, early humans were persistence hunters. We did not need to run faster than the great beasts. We did not need to overpower them in a single strike. We simply tracked them. When the beast sprinted away, we jogged after it. When it stopped to rest, we were there, walking toward it. When it ran again, we kept walking. We followed them for tens of hours, under the burning radiation of our sun, denying them sleep, denying them water, until their alien biology simply collapsed. We walked our prey to death until their hearts literally exploded from absolute exhaustion." Vile stared at the human, a profound, primal dread washing over his mind. He finally understood. The human was not weak. His entire biological structure was a highly compressed engine of pure, relentless endurance. The quiet sanctuary they had built, however, was not meant to last. The remaining enforcers of the Kragoth gang refused to accept the humiliating defeat of their leader. They knew they could not defeat the human in a direct, physical confrontation, especially not where the human could clearly see their movements. They decided to change the battlefield to favor their own biological advantages. During the middle of the third sleep cycle, the heavy magnetic locks of the technical sector slammed shut. An instant later, the primary power grid for the entire lower deck was violently severed. The ambient lighting systems died entirely. The sector plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The Kragoth possessed highly evolved auditory canals and echolocation suborgans, allowing them to navigate and hunt flawlessly in pitch-black environments. They moved into the maintenance bay with silent, deadly precision, drawing their serrated thermal blades. They expected to find the human stumbling blindly, terrified and completely helpless. They were completely unaware of the horrifying secondary survival mechanisms built into the human nervous system. When the lights died, Duncan did not panic. His brain instantly registered the sudden environmental threat and triggered a massive, concentrated dose of adrenaline directly into his bloodstream. His pupils dilated to their absolute maximum limit, forcing his eyes to gather every microscopic photon of ambient light bleeding from the distant emergency dials. His heart rate slowed down, conserving oxygen, while his auditory cortex became hypersensitive to the slightest vibration in the floorboards. In the dark, the human fight-or-flight response had chosen fight. Instead of staying in the open, Duncan slipped away, turning the complex, multi-level maintenance sector into a terrifying acoustic maze. The lead Kragoth crept forward, his ears twitching to catch the sound of a terrified heartbeat. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clang echoed from a ventilation shaft 50 meters to his left. The gang immediately rushed toward the sound, their heavy footsteps vibrating through the metal deck. Just as they reached the location, Another distinct clatter sounded from the catwalk high above them. Duncan was using the dense network of hollow air pipes and his heavy steel wrenches to project false auditory signatures. He was bouncing sound waves off the curved bulkheads, completely disorienting the Kragoth's natural echolocation. The alien enforcers began to panic. They swung their serrated blades wildly at empty shadows, the darkness suddenly feeling oppressive and infinitely hostile. Two of the massive aliens collided in the gloom, mistaking each other for the human, and traded vicious, bleeding blows before realizing their mistake. Then, the true nightmare began. Duncan did not engage them in a brawl. He operated like a mechanical ghost. He dropped silently from an overhead gantry, landing directly behind a solitary enforcer. Before the alien could draw a breath to scream, the human applied a flawless, high-pressure sleeper hold directly over the creature's twin carotid arteries. In less than 8 seconds, the massive Kragoth collapsed, entirely unconscious, lowered gently to the grating without making a single sound. One by one, the hunters became the hunted. The Kragoth found their comrades unconscious, their weapons stripped, their joints expertly locked into painful, immobile positions using zip ties and discarded electrical cabling. The only warning the remaining aliens ever received was a low, chilling, melodic whistle echoing softly through the narrow metallic corridors. It was a haunting, rhythmic human tune that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The remaining bullies threw down their weapons and fled blindly toward the exit, their minds entirely broken by the terrifying phantom that hunted them in the dark. High above the squalor of the lower maintenance decks, Warlord Gornak watched the silent security feeds with mounting, venomous fury. Gornak was the supreme leader of the Kragoth on the Tartarus station, an ancient and heavily scarred brute whose absolute authority was built entirely upon a meticulously crafted foundation of terror. The humiliating physical defeat of his best enforcer, followed by the psychological dismantling of his nighttime ambush squad, was utterly unacceptable. This fragile, strange human was actively shattering the ecosystem of fear that kept the mining operation running. A quiet rebellion was brewing among the lesser species, and Gornak knew he had to rip it out by the roots immediately. Brute force and direct confrontation had failed entirely. The human was far too elusive, too calculating, and too mechanically precise in his violence. Therefore, Gornak chose a weapon the human could not punch, outsmart, or dismantle. He chose suffocation. With a slow, deliberate strike of his massive hand across his central command console, Gornak initiated a total manual override of the primary life support grid for Level 4. He silently shut down the oxygen filtration and circulation systems for the entire residential block. The atmospheric processors would slowly bleed the breathable air from the sector, replacing it with heavy, toxic nitrogen. He would choke the life out of the hundreds of small, pathetic workers living there until the human dragged himself forward on his knees to beg for their survival. Deep within the atmospheric processing plant, Vial was conducting a routine diagnostic check when he noticed the environmental pressure dials dropping rapidly. The little lumen hurried toward the main exhaust valves, intending to manually clear what he innocently assumed was a mechanical blockage. Instead, he found 3 heavily armed Kragoth enforcers welding thick titanium plates directly over the intake vents. Before Vale could even attempt to sound the alarm, a massive scaled hand clamped over his mouth, violently lifting him completely off the deck. They dragged the terrified alien directly to the primary power core chamber. Gornak was waiting in the sweltering heat. The Supreme Leader wrapped a heavy industrial chain tightly around Vial's tiny waist and casually kicked him over the edge of the high catwalk. Vial shrieked as he plummeted, stopping with a bone-jarring jolt just 20 feet above the exposed, leaking thermal casing of the station's nuclear reactor. The ambient heat radiating from the core was agonizing, threatening to scorch his fragile, glowing skin into ash. Gornak leaned over the metal railing, his 6 arms gripping the barrier tight, his eyes burning with malice. "Let us see if your human savior can fix this," Gornak sneered into the sweltering abyss. Back in the makeshift sanctuary of Level 4, Duncan returned from a perimeter scavenging run. The very second he stepped through the heavy blast doors, his biologically dense lungs recognized the subtle, deadly shift in the environment. The air was growing undeniably thin, acquiring a metallic, stale taste that spoke of rapidly rising carbon dioxide levels. He glanced around the dimly lit chamber. The smaller workers were already beginning to gasp, their chests heaving as panic set in. Vile was nowhere to be found. Duncan did not roar in anger. He did not smash his fists against the rusted bulkhead or scream curses at the ceiling. His expression remained entirely stoic, but his eyes turned as cold and unforgiving as the vacuum of deep space. He walked calmly to the darkest corner of the room and dragged out a heavy, battered iron chest he had brought with him on his very first day. The heavy biometric lock clicked open under his thumb. Inside were no standard maintenance tools. These were the highly specialized, military-grade instruments of a former deep space disaster recovery engineer. He was a man biologically and psychologically trained to walk into collapsing starships, burning stations, and utterly toxic environments to extract survivors. Panic was a biological luxury he had trained out of his system decades ago. Duncan strapped a modular plasma cutter to his right thigh, slung a tightly coiled wire of microfilament over his broad shoulder, and loaded a heavy bandolier of magnetic pulse charges across his chest. The massive Kragoth relied heavily on their intimidating size and open spaces to physically dominate their prey. They completely ignored the labyrinth of narrow, claustrophobic ventilation shafts that snaked endlessly through the station walls. To a giant alien, those tunnels were completely inaccessible and irrelevant. To a human, they were a highly tactical, unseen highway. Duncan removed a heavy iron grate and slid effortlessly into the dark, cramped ductwork, moving with the silent, terrifying grace of an apex predator in its natural habitat. He began systematically blinding the enemy. A perfectly placed copper wire across a primary terminal junction instantly fried the main security cameras across 3 decks. A controlled magnetic burst completely scrambled the internal communication grid of the Kragoth enforcers. Piercing static shrieked in the earpieces of Gornak's personal guards, instantly severing them from their supreme leader's commands. The Tartarus station was no longer a Kragoth prison. The narrow metallic walls, the suffocating dark corners, and the complex electrical arteries had just become the absolute domain of human engineering. The board was set, the station had transformed into his home turf, and the ultimate hunt had officially begun. The ambient warning sirens of Sector 4 wailed an agonizing, mechanical scream. The atmospheric pressure was plummeting rapidly, sucking the warmth from the air and causing thin layers of toxic frost to bloom across the rusted bulkheads. Following a brutally efficient and entirely silent extraction from the thermal core chamber, Duncan carried the battered, barely conscious Vial over his broad shoulder. He led a desperate, frantic exodus of the remaining technical crews toward the primary safety airlock. It was the only barrier between them and the absolute vacuum of the station outer hull. But the massive, reinforced titanium blast door was already heavily descending. Gornak had permanently sealed the sector with an unbreakable optical lock code. The mechanism was entirely isolated from the main grid, rendering Duncan's electrical sabotage useless. There was zero time to systematically slice the mainframe. Duncan dropped Vale gently to the side and jammed a heavily modified, homemade hydraulic jack directly underneath the descending slab of solid metal. The alien machine screamed in protest under the weight of countless tons, its pneumatic seals bursting almost instantly in a spray of corrosive fluid. The thick door continued its merciless, grinding crawl downward. If that massive lock engaged, hundreds of fragile, innocent aliens would suffocate in the dark. This was the exact threshold where human biology completely defied pure, calculated logic. A Kragoth, or any other logically evolved species, would have instantly calculated the structural odds, recognized the impending mechanical failure, and quietly accepted the inevitability of death. A human simply refused to accept the mathematics of defeat. Deep within the ancient, primal architecture of the human brain lies a hidden override switch. When faced with the absolute extreme of survival or the necessary protection of the weak, the human nervous system completely bypasses its own biological safety limiters, granting access to a terrifying phenomenon known as hysterical strength. Duncan threw his heavy metal cane aside and stepped directly beneath the descending titanium blast door. He planted his heavy boots firmly into the grated floor, squared his wide shoulders against the crushing metal, and pushed violently upward. The resulting sound of his own skeletal structure protesting the impossible load was utterly sickening. Thick cartilage compressed to its absolute breaking point. Heavy veins bulged against his neck and forearms like incredibly thick steel cables. The extreme, rapid drop in surrounding atmospheric pressure violently ruptured the delicate blood vessels deep within his nasal cavity, sending a thick, steady stream of dark, crimson blood cascading down his chin and chest. Yet, the frail, unarmored human did not yield a single fraction of an inch. His muscle fibers literally tore beneath his skin. His joints popped and cracked. But through sheer, unfathomable willpower, he forced the multi-ton door to a grinding, agonizing halt. "Go!" Duncan grunted, his voice a raw, tearing sound, forced through tightly clenched, bloody teeth. The terrified workers did not hesitate. They scrambled rapidly through the narrow, life-saving gap. They squeezed desperately under the crushing weight of the metal slab, weeping in pure gratitude and absolute terror. They poured into the safe zone by the hundreds. Finally, Duncan reached down with one trembling hand, grabbed the frail, faintly glowing body of Vale, and shoved the small alien forcefully across the metal threshold. Heavy, synchronized footsteps suddenly echoed through the rapidly thinning air behind him. Gornak and his heavily armored elite royal guard marched into the failing corridor. They formed a tight, heavily armed half-circle around the struggling human. The broken hydraulic jack finally shattered into a dozen useless pieces. Knowing the workers were safe, Duncan completely relaxed his shoulders and rolled backward across the deck just as the massive titanium door slammed shut with a final, earth-shaking thud. The heavy locking bolts engaged instantly. Duncan was completely sealed inside the dying sector, cut off from the safe zone. The breathable air was now critically thin, burning the lungs with every drawn breath. Gornak towered over the exhausted, kneeling human. A cruel, rumbling laugh vibrated violently from the warlord's massive chest, echoing through the sealed tomb. "You absolute, pathetic fool," the warlord mocked, drawing a long, dangerously humming thermal blade that cast a sinister, blood-red light across the darkened corridor. "You threw your own life away for a worthless swarm of useless insects. You dug your own grave, human. Now you are trapped in a dead zone, completely suffocating, and entirely surrounded by the most lethal, biologically superior warriors ever born to kill." The warlord raised his heavy, burning blade, fully intending to butcher the frail creature right there on the rusted floor. Duncan did not look terrified. He did not look defeated or broken. He slowly stood up, wiped the thick blood from his face, and left a smeared, dark red streak across his heavy jaw. He leaned his tired back heavily against the sealed blast door and let out a low, incredibly dark chuckle. He turned his head and spat a mouthful of dark blood onto the steel grating, entirely ruining the warlord's pristine boots. Reaching casually into the deep breast pocket of his torn, grease-stained jumpsuit, Duncan pulled out a small, heavy piece of specialized technology. It was a remote magnetic detonator. "You think I am trapped in here with you?" Duncan asked, his voice a gravelly, chilling whisper that completely cut through the dying, mechanical hum of the station. "No, you are locked in here with me." Without a single second of hesitation, the human pressed the button. The remote detonator sent an invisible, localized pulse directly through the deck plates. A series of deep, concussive explosions immediately violently rocked the foundation of Sector 4. Duncan had not simply targeted the blast doors. The strategically placed magnetic charges systematically obliterated the sub-level artificial gravity generators and blew a precise, calculated hole directly through the secondary reinforced glass of the outer observation port. The resulting atmospheric decompression was instantaneous and unimaginably violent. The heavy, toxic air of the corridor shrieked as it was violently sucked out into the infinite blackness of deep space. Then, the roaring sound completely died. It was replaced by the absolute, terrifying silence of a localized vacuum. Simultaneously, the crushing weight of the station vanished. The environment instantly shifted into a state of absolute zero gravity. For the hulking Kragoth warriors, this was an incomprehensible nightmare. Biologically evolved to dominate through overwhelming physical mass and firmly planted leverage. The giants were suddenly completely adrift, their massive size transformed into a lethal liability. As their heavy boots lost contact with the rusted deck, they began to thrash wildly in the silent void. 6 massive arms flailed in blind panic, desperately searching for a physical fulcrum that simply did not exist. With zero atmospheric pressure, the oxygen was violently ripped from their bloodstreams. The elite guards began to violently asphyxiate, vomiting dark fluids inside their heavy combat helmets as they spun uncontrollably in the air. Duncan, however, demonstrated the absolute, terrifying pinnacle of human survival training. A fraction of a second before the blast, he had forcefully exhaled every single ounce of air from his lungs, completely preventing the fatal barotrauma that would have ruptured his internal organs in the vacuum. With cold, mechanical precision, he tapped the heels of his specialized engineering boots together. Heavy electromagnetic clamps instantly engaged, anchoring him firmly to the metallic floor grating. In the horrifying, silent void of the freezing corridor, the human did not panic. He walked. He moved through the floating, thrashing giants like an untethered mechanical ghost. Duncan raised his heavy plasma wrench. With brutal, efficient strikes, he systematically shattered the emergency oxygen regulators strapped to the armor of the elite guards. He left them drifting, completely helpless, trapped in a slow, agonizing suffocation. Finally, he locked his magnetic boots against a nearby bulkhead and launched himself across the corridor in a perfectly calculated vector. Duncan collided violently with Gornak midair, using his own momentum to drive the massive warlord brutally down against the solid steel deck. The human locked his magnetic boots back onto the floor, firmly pinning the giant alien beneath him. Gornak writhed in pure agony, his terrifying thermal blade completely useless as his alien biology collapsed under the extreme vacuum. His eyes bulged violently, pleading in absolute terror. Duncan stared down at the tyrant, counting the exact seconds of biological failure. Just 3 seconds before the Kragoth warlord suffered irreversible brain death. Duncan reached up and forcefully jammed a bypass module directly into the emergency environmental panel above them. Heavy titanium collision shutters instantly slammed down over the shattered observation port, completely sealing the breach. The primary atmospheric turbines roared back to life, violently pumping heavily oxygenated air back into the sector. A second later, the artificial gravity violently re-engaged. The floating Kragoth warriors crashed heavily onto the steel deck, a tangled mass of broken armor and humiliated giants. Underneath Duncan, Gornak gasped violently, drawing in massive, agonizing breaths of air. The warlord turned to his side and vomited a thick pool of dark blood onto the floor. His terrifying aura was completely shattered. Trembling violently, the giant raised his 6 arms, shielding his face as he looked up at the old, frail human. "I yield," Gornak choked out, his voice a pathetic, broken wheeze. "Please, I beg you, do not kill me." Duncan slowly deactivated his magnetic boots and stood over the broken giant. He knew the internal security cameras had rebooted alongside the life support grid. Every single worker across the entire Tartarus station was currently watching the live feed of the Supreme Tyrant weeping on his knees. Duncan did not execute him. He simply left the warlord there, letting the absolute, recorded humiliation completely dismantle the Empire of Fear. The heavy blast doors at the end of the corridor finally groaned open. A sleek, hovering artificial intelligence drone, dispatched directly by the Tartarus corporate conglomerate, floated into the room. The glowing blue optic of the drone scanned the brutal aftermath. "Incident evaluated?" The synthesized voice of the artificial intelligence echoed coldly. "Kragoth enforcement efficiency has reached absolute zero. However, under the localized protection of employee Duncan Browning, overall technical sector productivity has increased by hundreds of % over the past operational cycles. Former warlord Gornak is hereby stripped of all authoritative credentials." The drone swiveled its optic toward the human. "However, employee Duncan Browning, you are entirely responsible for millions of credits in catastrophic property damage. Corporate mandates, severe penalization, and immediate termination of employment." Before the drone could process the arrest warrant, a massive, unified sound echoed from the open doorway. Thousands of small, fragile workers marched into the corridor. Viel walked at the very front, his bioluminescence glowing a brilliant, blinding blue of absolute defiance. The workers did not speak. They simply formed a massive, impenetrable physical wall around Duncan, linking their small arms together. Every single maintenance engineer, every miner, and every janitorial slave stood their ground. They entirely ceased all station operations. The artificial intelligence drone paused, rapidly calculating the devastating financial loss of a total, station-wide labor strike. The numbers cascaded into billions of lost credits per hour. The machine logic was absolute. "Re-evaluating parameters," the drone announced smoothly. "Total labor cessation is unacceptable to corporate profit margins. Compromise enacted. Employee Duncan Browning is hereby promoted to Chief of Station Security. All penalizations dismissed. Please resume mining operations." Duncan looked at the massive crowd of aliens standing fearlessly by his side. He let out a soft, genuine laugh, reaching out to gently pat Vale on the shoulder. He accepted the security badge from the drone, officially establishing a new, unbreakable cross-species alliance. The long nightmare of the Tartarus station was finally over. The human had proven a universal truth to the stars: the greatest, most absolute fear of any bully is the day the weak finally realize they are not alone. Thank you so very much for listening to today's story. We truly appreciate your time and your wonderful support. Where in the world are you tuning in from today? We would love to know. If you enjoyed this journey and want to help us keep the lights on, please consider supporting our team with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by using the PayPal link provided in the description and pinned comment below. Your kindness helps our staff feed their families and allows us to continue creating better, more thrilling sci-fi stories just for you. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you in the next adventure.